So we've covered aim, we've covered shoot, and we're about to move on to skin. But before we move on, let's have a quick recap to see that we're doing the aim and the shoot step correctly. This is how you should feel and the stage that you should be at by the time you finish the shoot. And if this is how it feels, then you probably know that you've done the aim and the shoot step correctly. So before you start, you don't know anything about the topic. You've got all your resources. When you do the aim step, you create curiosity. You've got questions, especially those why and how does it relate questions. We're building potential scaffolding for relationships and structure. After that, we're then going to shoot. We're answering those questions and trying to figure it out in our mind, especially number one, starting with building that basic logic, and then going back to look at building those concepts, and then going back, adding in those important details. Now, at this stage, we've got arbitrary details left over that we need to just rote learn and memorize. For now, until I teach you what to do with that a little bit more effectively, just chuck them on flashcards or a Google Doc or something. It doesn't really matter yet. Most ways of rote learning are not extremely effective anyway, until I teach you some of the really efficient techniques later on. But for now, you shouldn't have too many things to rote learn anymore, because actually a lot of it just makes sense based on your logic, concepts, and important details, and it should be on your mind map, which means that if you had normally 50 flashcards to make, now you'll only have 10 or 20 flashcards. So we've cut down on the amount of memorization by quite a lot, okay? So you can do whatever you want with that at the moment. Digital flashcards, something like Anki or Quizlet is something that I would just recommend, okay? We'll come back to that later. But by now, we may be missing the very, very specific recall on those details, but we've got a pretty solid understanding of the big picture, how those concepts work, and it should start feeling like the topic makes a lot of sense. And in fact, you should already start feeling like you're getting a pretty decent level of retention here. You might have done the aim step before learning it in class, maybe before the term even began. You might have done the shoot step, again, at any time really. You could have done it during class and then carried it on, adding on more concepts. So you might have done layer 1 and bits of layer 2 during class. You come home later that day and you finish off layer 2 and add bits of layer 3 or even layer 4. You might have even carried it on into the weekend to finish off the layers that you're able to do. So it's pretty flexible. You could do all of aim and shoot before you even learn it, just using your course guides or other resources that you've got available. You know, it's very flexible what you can do with this. Remember, you're taking control of the learning the way that you need to. So after you've done this, then what's the next step? Well, the next step is to really consolidate this knowledge and bring ourselves to a higher level of knowledge mastery. And a higher level of knowledge mastery basically means that you're better able to answer questions, nail those exams, really hit those curveball questions out of the park, and overall just feel much more comfortable with the topic. And that's what the skin step is for. The skin step allows us to really drive up our retention even more and get ourselves extremely comfortable and confident with the content. So let's have a look at what's happening in our brain when we do the skin step. And what I want to draw your attention to is actually this thing called Bloom's taxonomy. You may have heard of this before. It's pretty well known. But Bloom's taxonomy is basically a hierarchy for the mastery of knowledge. So this is the top of the pyramid, obviously. This is the bottom. This is the lowest level. This is the highest level of mastery. Let's have a look at what each of these different levels of mastery actually equate to in terms of the results that you'd get and what these types of students would actually feel like. So at the lowest level, we have memorization. Memorization means that you're able to list everything out. You're able to remember and describe specific facts. You're able to recall details. The way that people study in order to achieve memorization is often through repetition. It's tedious, it's very time consuming. Okay, time plus. That's memorization. Students who focus their learning at this level and only achieve this are the ones that are likely to barely pass, or if they do pass, really do actually struggle a lot. So they spend a lot of time studying. Studying is not enjoyable whatsoever. These are the people that are grinding out constantly, and actually most of the time, these students are the ones that would actually fail. So you, given that you're actually on this course, potentially are not at this level. The next level above memorization, right? So that's level 1. Level 2, this is understanding. Now, you may have heard the saying, it's one thing to know and another thing to understand, and that real learning is about understanding it. Well, this is not exactly true. As you can see, it's only level 2 of 6 possible levels. And actually, the understanding, what that means is that this person is able to explain something. They can have a discussion around it. They're able to really converse about this and really elaborate on their points. So if you understand something, you can explain it. That makes sense, right? So how do people that get to this level study? People that get to an understanding level, they study through much the same as the memorization people, but they take it to another level where they might do maybe some practice. Maybe they might try to paraphrase. Maybe they'll try active recall a little bit more. Active recall is used in both of these. So this is when we have a very minimal processing. Okay, minimal processing. There is an attempt to try to understand. We're trying to understand how it works. And so we paraphrase and do things like this. Okay, reading and rereading to figure it out and just try to understand how it works. And this is the part that takes a long time for most students. This is a part that takes a long time for most students. And this is where most students will get stuck at. And so most high-achieving students, well, relatively high-achieving students, are actually here. So what does this look like? These students are often in the sort of top 30% of achievement. They are not really at risk of failing, but they don't really get the top marks. Okay? They also spend quite a lot of time trying to learn. And again, it doesn't tend to be enjoyable, but they do still have these occasional light bulb moments which feel really good because it suddenly clicks and makes sense, but it doesn't happen that frequently. So that's level 2. What about level 3? You can see at level 3, it's green. The reason I've made it green is because level 3 is the first part in which we are using our brain as per the cave theory. Level 3 is application, okay? Being able to apply your knowledge. So that means that you can actually use what you've understood to solve problems, okay? You can apply the knowledge to other types of content. So outside of just what you learned, you can actually now use the understanding. Now, remember what I said before, that in order to actually learn something, right? Learning equals being able to at least apply the information, okay? Retain the information and then apply it. You need to be able to use the information for there to be learning. Remember also what I said about the cave theory, in that the brain has a checklist and that it thinks it's relevant. It will increase the number of connections. It will make it more meaningful, and it will create more relationships It's more likely to be retained if it fulfills a problem-solving criteria and a pattern-forming criteria. So applying the knowledge is part of problem-solving. So wait a second. If the cave theory says that this is how we should do all of our learning, or at least as much as possible, and if learning means to apply it, doesn't that mean that this is the first level in which learning is actually happening efficiently? And the answer is yes. The answer is yes, which is why, amazingly, what we know is that this level is the minimum level at which your brain is actually being used efficiently. And that's why it's green, because we want to be above this level at all times. Now, you might think, well, Justin, how is it possible to be above the level at all times? How can you apply something that you don't even understand or you can't even recall? And that's true. You can't. But there's a difference between what you're trying to do versus what your brain will do. Here's what I mean. If you try to memorize something, it's very difficult. If you try to understand it, you will end up memorizing it more easily. That's just how your brain works. But if you try to apply it, you will understand it more deeply. And what research has found, and this is the really amazing thing about the brain, honestly, it's fascinating the way that it works. What we have found is that your brain actually learns faster when you don't try to understand or memorize at all. Okay, let me say that again. If you skip this step, number 1 and 2, and we want to go straight to level 3, which is applying, okay? If we try to apply our knowledge as early as possible, we don't even try to memorize or understand anything. We don't spend any effort. We have no intention of memorizing or understanding. We purely just want to apply things. We read a sentence and straight away we try to use that to solve problems. Then what that actually does is that it activates the cave theory of learning straight away. It activates that inquiry-based learning. Okay, inquiry-based learning gets activated straight away. And what our brain will do is that it will actually fill in the gaps underneath it. It will understand and memorize it more easily. Okay, so counterintuitively, we don't actually need to try to memorize or understand anything in order to memorize and understand it. In fact, even more counterintuitively, trying to not memorize and trying to not understand, and instead trying to jump straight to applying it as soon as possible, activates such a more efficient learning pattern in our brain that we will end up understanding and memorizing it better than if we had actually tried to memorize and understand it in the first place, okay? It's a bit of a mind twist, but it basically means skipping steps 1 and step number 2 and going straight to step 3 here actually allows you to do number 1 and number 2 better than if you were to try to actually spend time here. So here's the thing, and this is the this is the important thing here, right? Is that, okay, number 1, applying it, thinking of problems, applying information to problems, that's what we set ourselves up to do in the aim step. Do you see that? What the aim step does is that it forces us to get to here from the very beginning. How does it do that? Because we are doing it before we've actually understood what we're making questions about. By making questions first, we force our brain up here instead of trudging through all of this very slowly. The aim step activates problem solving because we are creating problems and trying to apply knowledge that we don't even have yet. And then by trying to solve these problems straight away, we are applying the information immediately. Okay, we're applying the information immediately. And remember, this is not me making stuff up. This is Bloom's taxonomy. This is extremely well studied and researched. I encourage you to look it up more yourself. So after aiming, when we shoot, the shoot step is activating this part of our brain directly which is why it actually helps us understand and memorize it much faster, okay? So that's how it works, and that's why the mind map is done that way, and that's why the layers of learning exist as well for this purpose. It helps our brain jump straight to this level, and it does feel a little bit concerning when you first do it, because it's just like, I feel a little, it's like, I feel like I really should be taking things from the bottom and going up progressively, but it's one of those situations where actually it's better to just jump, aim higher, and you will land higher. It really, really does work. And actually, this phenomenon is so powerful and actually so unknown. It's kind of like a secret of learning that so few people know. That there's actually a best-selling book based on this, and this is actually called Ultra Learning. And very few people are aware of this, even though it's, I'm not actually sure why so few people are aware of this. It's extremely well studied, and we've known about this for at least decades. So a lot of people still don't know, but this can be your secret weapon, your hidden unfair advantage against all the other students that you're competing against, is to go straight to here. So anyway, so people that jump straight to here, okay, what do they look like? So they're usually achieving results in the top 10%. They are the first step at which the time that's spent is much less. And you can see why. Because your brain is learning at a higher efficiency, therefore, you're spending less time trying to figure it out, okay? You're able to understand it much faster because your brain is operating at a higher gear. And also, your retention is higher, so therefore, you're doing less relearning, which is obviously saving time. So all of that good stuff that I've been talking about this entire time, that really starts here. When we jump straight to here straight away, okay, after every sentence, after every word, if it's possible, you want to really try to apply that to solve problems, okay? So that's what it looks like, top 10%. All right, now I've joined these arrows here together because 3 and 4 often come kind of similarly in terms of what their achievement is. Number 4, this is actually analyze, okay, or analysis. So analysis, what that means is that we're able to compare ideas or concepts against each other. Okay, we're able to contrast, find similarities and differences. So this should ring a bell as well. Analysis, comparing concepts with each other, contrasting them with each other, finding how they are related. So at this point, we are activating the relationships more strongly. We're focusing on the relationships more strongly, okay? So how do we get to an application point of view? People spend a lot of time here. Problem solving, that's where the primary study techniques are based around. It's different types of problem solving. And the key thing is it happens as early as possible. They don't wait until just before the exam to do just a bunch of past papers, practice questions. They go into problem solving even before they've learned the topic. I know, sounds crazy, but it works. People here at the relationships part, what are they doing? These people, they're looking at doing mind maps, but not just any mind maps that are prioritizing the relationships, okay? They're looking to see how they can form those relationships a little bit more clearly. And they're trying to really focus on the relationships, even in the problem solving. So they're not just problem solving in terms of the bad what questions. They are asking those questions in terms of how does it relate? How is it all connected? They're asking these questions, okay? And they're achieving results in the top 10%, and their amount of time is much, much less, okay? Much, much less than people before. So there's really quite a clean line drawn kind of here. People above this line are, I would say, in the realm of efficient studying. People below this line, so all these people here, they're in the realm of beginner, low-level efficiency studying. This is obviously not where you want to be. You want to be at least here and above. So what's the step above that? Well, the step above this is level number 5, which is evaluation, being able to evaluate ideas. So evaluating ideas mean that you can actually weigh and critique and I'm going to run out of space here, prioritize okay? Prioritize different concepts against each other. So it's like analysis, but even better than analysis, because we're not just looking at how are the relationships, connected and how are the different ideas and concepts related to each other. We're now thinking which relationships, okay, which concepts are the most important, okay? We're thinking, okay, we've got concept number 1 versus concept number 2. I think concept number 1 is slightly more important in some cases, whereas concept number 2 is more important if it comes along with concept number 3. So we're not just able to compare and contrast it, we're actually able to weigh, critique, and prioritize different ideas against each other. So we have a really solid understanding of these relationships. At here, it might still be surface level relationships. Still better than down here where the relationships don't exist. But up here, our knowledge is heavily relational. And so you can see that the questions that are being asked here is, why is this important? These are the questions. So you can see how that aim step is aiming to drive us up here in this green zone. The aim step forces our brain to work at layers 3, 4, and 5. And okay, here's the thing. You really want to be at level 5 as much as possible, but it's not really possible to be up here all the time. So what I actually find with real life and students is that you're kind of always going up and down, 3, 4, 5, 3, 4, 5. You're going up and down this point. But the thing that most students struggle with is actually getting to this point. People can go back and forth between here, but information can get quite overwhelming if you don't try to prioritize certain ideas over others, because the relationships all are kind of become sort of a mess. And so those mind maps that we saw before, where, yeah, there were a lot of arrows going back and forth between them, but it wasn't clean, right? The relationships weren't clean. It almost seemed a bit chaotic. The connections and relationships certainly existed, but it was kind of everywhere, right? Well, people that do this step up here, this is when those relationships start looking clean. There's a clear flow. You can clearly see the purpose behind the concepts and how it all relates together. Okay, this is the evaluation step. And students at this step, they are usually achieving in the top 1%. They spend very, very, very little time studying because their mind is working so much more efficiently. And remember, this has nothing to do with intelligence. This is all a skill. These are all skills. All of these are skills that you can learn that I have taught you, okay? And you can all do this. So students up here are operating in that top 1%. These are the results they're getting. They're actually finding learning to be enjoyable because they're discovering things. And that light bulb moment that I mentioned before, that students don't often get, these students are getting these moments constantly, again and again and again. They're able to turn these light bulb moments on voluntarily, okay? So they have a light bulb moment with every single subject. What's their easiest subject? Every subject is their easiest subject. So these are the students at which I'd say this is a high-level learner. So when I say high-level learner, I'm talking about high level up here. Low-level learners, mid-level learners, high-level learners up here, okay? Now, what is the bit at the top, the very, very, the pinnacle? This is number 6, which is to create. And it really does mean that people that are at this level, they're able to, create new ideas or sort of conjecture, which is like to hypothesize new things, okay? So these people are able to use their knowledge of all of this to actually create new and original ideas. So where do you find people like this? These are usually people that are doing their PhDs, PhD, H to be small, PhDs. These are normally people that are truly experts in the field. It takes a long time to go from here to here. There's a big difference, even though it's only one level of difference. It's a big jump. This is a level that a lot of students will not reach for years of learning that subject. You should still try to reach this. I recommend students that are comfortable with this stage to play around with this in their revision, and I will introduce techniques later on that allow you to do this, really for the experts, but it's just not something that's, number one, really necessary to reach because it is a very high level. And also, you've got enough on your plate just trying to reach here and stay here as often as possible. So I'm not really going to focus too much of this until I get to really more advanced techniques for students that are already comfortable with all of this here. So this is really a peak apex level learner. And you can do there's a lot of really fun, interesting study techniques that are extremely efficient that we can apply if you're at that level, but I'm not really going to cover that right now. So this is now looking at that top 0.1% or even less than that. So these people, learning is very easy for them. They don't need to spend virtually any effort in actually learning things. They're able to learn things much faster than a normal person would be able to. Their retention will be at 90% and above every time they learn anything new. They're extremely in control of their learning, and academic challenge is just not something that exists for them. I would say that this is a point where maybe your actual IQ does make a bit of a difference, whether you can get there or not. But below this, all of this is just skill, okay? So it doesn't matter if you could be failing before, even if you're down here, look, it's possible to get up here. Yeah, it'll take longer than someone who's been living here their entire life, but consistent work, going through these steps and trying to use these techniques instead of these techniques will bring your brain up here and you will see the results. But remember, it will feel a bit challenging, but that difficulty is part of the learning process. And the aim and shoot steps, the aim step tries to get you up here as quickly as possible. So let's actually write that in so it's a bit more clear, right? So aim is, this is what aim does. Aim says we're aiming up here. We're aiming our brain to activate this level of learning. When we're shooting, we are usually actually in this stage here. Shooting is usually layers 3 and 4, applying it and analyzing it, okay? Why is that? Even though we've asked the question, why is it important while we are shooting in our aim step? Why, even though we've asked this question, why is that? Well, remember I said at the beginning, when you do a mind map for the first time, it might be a bit chaotic. Well, that's kind of the thing, is that it's really difficult to get an extremely clean flow of ideas where you've really evaluated all the relationships to figure out which is the most important. It's really hard to weigh, critique, and prioritize all the concepts that you're learning in the first go. When you're first shooting, it's very difficult to get up here. And that's actually what the skin step is. The skin step is your chance to take that learning and bring it up, okay? The skin step allows you to take your mind map and clean it up. It allows you to spend time looking and examining your relationships to allow it to become higher efficiency, more well-retained, more logical, where you're driving up that level of learning. So if you were really, really good at the shoot step, like really good at the shoot step, and it's just second nature to you, then you can get to this stage in the first go, and you actually wouldn't need a skin step, okay? If you're really good at shoot, you don't actually need the skin step. But for 95% of students who are trying the Bear Hunter system for the first few months even, it's pretty hard to get to this stage initially. And even for me, honestly, some subjects that I learn, I'm not able to get here straight away, and I'll need to do a shoot and then a skin, okay? And sometimes it's just not necessary to try to get here in the first go because it just takes more effort, and it's like, I'm perfectly happy to stick with this and then take it up here in the skin step. So that's what the skin step does, all right? So the aim, shoot brings us here, skin will take us up here where we're at an evaluation step. And in further revision with advanced techniques, maybe we can even get up here. Okay, so I want to take a moment to go into, we'll go into the skin step, but I want to take a moment first to outline another extremely important studying technique. And this is, again, one of those things that it's like, I cannot believe the brain can do this. It's so powerful at learning that it can do this, okay? So let's look at those techniques, the questions that we ask in the aim step. Why is it important? We ask that question because it allows us to build logic and relationships. How does it relate to everything? We ask that question because it allows us to build relationships. But when we apply the same question, how does it relate? During the skin step, what we are actually doing is that we can actually do something called chunking, okay? Chunking. It doesn't sound very glamorous, but it is a very cool psychological phenomenon of learning that your brain is able to undergo, okay? So let's actually have a look at what chunking is. Chunking is this thing that happens in your brain when you literally put information in chunks. When you put information in chunks, okay? So let's say that each of these dots represents a fact or a concept, a piece of information, okay? Here, we haven't chunked it. We haven't chunked it, and here we have chunked it, okay? But here we haven't chunked it. So each information point exists in isolation, right? Here, we don't have good relationships formed. We don't have any patterns formed. So this is what studying would normally look like if you had just memorized it or learned it through rote, thousands of flashcards. This is what the knowledge looks like inside your brain. It's not connected, it's not chunked. So your brain now needs to remember 4 by 3, 12, let's just call it units of information, okay? And it takes 12 times the amount of energy to maintain this. So because it's more energy consuming, your brain is more likely to forget it. And in this case, your brain is likely to just wipe out the entire set of knowledge because none of it is connected to anything, okay? But, let's just say, for example, that it is at least a little bit connected to something, and so your brain doesn't forget all of it. But the retention on this is going to be low, okay? We can expect that the retention is going to be low. Now, what happens when we create these relationships is that by finding patterns, okay? By finding patterns, ways that the information is similar, common trends, ways that they are different to each other. What we can do is we can actually group different bits of information together, okay? So for example, we might say all the different catalysts that are used for a certain type of reaction all seem to be very similar in terms of the atoms or the elements that make it up. Or we might say that all the characters in the first half of this book seem to predominantly have a certain theme to them. Or all the types of character development tend to have a certain trend to it. Or all the different enzymes seem to activate molecules by the same mechanism. Or all questions that involve trigonometry with a person on a cliff at a certain distance of meters, they tend to be solved by using this particular equation, followed by this particular equation, right? So what we're doing is we're looking at our knowledge. We're examining. We're taking our eye and we're saying, okay, we've got all these points of information. We're looking at it and we're trying to find patterns, ways that there's similar, trends, or even differences between them so that we can actually group the information together. So let's say that this, and this share some similarities. These things are all related to each other, and these two are related to each other. So what our brain actually does when we do that, and this is super cool, is that it actually creates these things that are called chunks. So this is one chunk, this is one chunk, this is one chunk, okay? And I mean, these aren't chunked, so these are kind of seen as their individual points. And so what we actually find is that the brain now doesn't actually need to spend 12 units of energy to store it because we've got 1, 2, 3 chunks plus 4, 5, 6, including the other unchunked pieces of information. There's only 6 things for our brain to hold on to. Now, it doesn't actually just use 6 units of energy. It's not quite like that. Realistically, it's more like 7 or 8 units of energy, okay? So like one chunk here is, represents a little bit more than just like 1 unit of energy. But the idea is that it's actually easier for your brain to remember chunks than it is to remember individual pieces of information. And actually, because there are more relationships between them as well, the retention goes up as well. Okay, and obviously the efficiency goes up with it. And okay, that's kind of okay, that's fine. But the cool thing about the brain is that, you know, when you download something and you get it in like a .zip file, you know, and you have to like uncompress and like you get, you know, multiple files that were inside it, but it's like compressed here. And then when you extract it, you get all the files. Well, that's actually how the brain kind of works when it comes to chunks. Each chunk is like a zip file. And when you access the chunk, your brain is able to actually extract all the points inside it much more easily. So what that means is that this chunk with 4 pieces of information connected inside of it, this is easier for your brain to remember than those 4 chunks by themselves. Your brain can still recall each individual point, but for some reason, because you've chunked it, it's just easier for your brain to hold on to that information, okay? And it's probably, and the science isn't extremely clear on this yet, but it's probably that there's a higher level of retention because of the fact that there's more relationships, more connections being formed, which goes back to the cave theory. So the relationship aspect is probably the reason why chunking works, but it could actually be a separate psychological phenomenon, but probably it's because increasing relationships. And the way that I like to sort of think about it is like a zip file, or like these Russian dolls. You know, these dolls where you get one and this one kind of goes inside the other one, and then this one goes inside the other one, and then you could have like 20 of these. It's kind of like that. Your brain sort of stores the big doll, and then all the other ones sort of pop out from underneath it. Or another way of thinking about it is, if you remember that analogy I made before with the room, and how when you're trying to organize information in your brain, that's kind of what learning is. And so if you're not organizing the information, then you'll have a room with all the items just scattered on the floor, and trying to find and retrieve anything takes forever. Whereas if you put them inside like the drawer and the wardrobe and the dressing side table and the laundry basket, you know where the information generally is. So when you're trying to recall and retrieve that information, it's much faster to do it. So it increases your ability to recall. Well, what chunking is it's saying, okay, this is basically chunking, okay? But we can chunk even more. We can take this drawer and we can say, okay, this drawer, instead of like opening up a drawer and then inside it just being this disorganized mess of just stuff inside it, what we can do is we can have that drawer, we can go to our nearest Japanese market and we can buy one of those stationary organizers, okay? And then like we can put all of our pens here, and we can put all of our knives here, and our pencils here, and our whatever erasers here. And so now it's even more organized. So it's like organization inside organization, okay? So it's a chunk inside a chunk, okay? And the more we chunk things, the better it is, the better the effect is, okay? Or it's like a zip file inside a zip file inside a zip file. So we actually want to create as many chunks as possible. So when we first do the aim step and the shoot step, we will end up forming some chunks, okay? So we're already doing this a little bit, but we do the skin step in order to create even more chunks. So we're looking for more opportunities to chunk it, okay? So we might have thought, okay, we've made these chunks, but then you look at it again and you think, oh, hey, look, I can actually chunk this whole chunk here. Man, the word chunk is starting to lose meaning. I can actually take this chunk and I can take this here, and I can actually create an even larger chunk of that. And oh, if I chunk that, I can actually chunk this together. So now we've actually got 2 massive chunks with different chunks inside them with individual points inside that. So it's like organization inside of organization inside of organization. And this is when knowledge starts becoming really, really simple, because when you're trying to explain it to someone, you can just say, oh, this topic is really just about this and this, and then a side point here. And then when they say, oh, explain this for me a little bit more, you can say, oh yeah, that's really just talking about this versus this, and then this point. And inside this point is like about this, how that's related to this in order to achieve this. So you can see it's very simple to understand. So an expert is able to explain something to a 5-year-old, okay? An expert can explain something to a 5-year-old. A beginner can't explain it. A beginner relies on this type of knowledge where they say, okay, well, this topic is about this, and this means this, this means this, this means. So it's very disorganized and it's very superficial. They're not able to really navigate this topic very effectively. It has to be kind of in this order and it's very detail focused, whereas an expert is able to say like, oh, it's this relationship and how it works here, okay? And that comes down to chunking, which comes down to forming relationships. So let's see this in practice a little bit. Here's one of the mind maps that we looked at before. This is what that mind map looks like when we're doing it information first. So let's look at this and evaluate it in terms of the relationships. And let's look at it in terms of the chunks that were formed. All right. So first of all, relationships. Look, we can see that there are some relationships that have been formed here. We've got cardiovascular system leading to blood pressure, leading to these different things here, leading to these different things here. So we can see there are relationships being formed. So are there relationships? Yes, there are relationships being formed. Are those relationships clear? Okay. Are those relationships clear? They're not very clear. You can see that it's kind of hard to follow, but also when we look at the chunks, do we see any opportunities for more chunking? Can you see any opportunities where you can create more chunks? Here's a tip. You don't need to know anything about the cardiovascular system to spot chunks, okay? I've taught people law, I've taught people economics. Trust me, I'm not an expert at any of those topics, but the studying technique is exactly the same. How do we know we have an opportunity for more chunks? We can usually create more chunks when there is more than roughly four or more branches coming off from any individual point. So let's highlight those areas where there is an opportunity for more chunking, okay? Here, you can see that we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 branches coming off of blood pressure here, which means that we can probably chunk some of these together. We can find similarities and differences between this and this, or this and this, or this and this, or this and this, or this and this, and we can kind of bring it together, okay? So let's just do that for this point right now. So here we've got an idea about what's called exchange in periphery and net filtration pressure. So this is talking about the fact that blood, when it goes out into our peripheries, like our arms and our fingers and legs and stuff, that there's blood and blood gas exchange, okay, allowing our organs and our limbs to get oxygen and, exchange the waste products and all of that sort of stuff, okay? That's what this is talking about. This here, net filtration pressure, this is actually talking about the blood pressure that causes the exchange to occur. All right. So what happens is that this pressure forces fluid outside of our blood vessels and it kind of seeps into all of our tissues and it allows it to exchange properly. Okay. So what that actually means is that these 2 points are actually related to each other. So I could get rid of this and actually just have a single arrow coming out of this that goes to the idea of exchange, which is contributed towards by net filtration pressure. So do you see what I've done is I've created a chunk here. I've created these two and I've chunked them into one thing, which is the concept of just exchange, right? So we can do that for any of these other points as well. So here, there's a lot of things around anatomy. There are a lot of different hormones here. There are, a lot of things here under SAAV node, okay? Conduction system, action potential. So even if you don't know what these words are, it should stick out to you. And I'm not going to go over and teach you all of these things, but purely by doing that, I can tell you for a fact, it is possible to chunk all of these things that we have circled, okay? It is possible to chunk all of these things that we have circled. These can be divided into 3 different chunks. This could be divided into, again, 2 different chunks actually. This one can actually be divided into 3 chunks. And then this one can be divided into 2 chunks. And this one can be divided into 2 chunks as well. So by doing that, we would have increased our chunking. So here, is the chunking done well? It's done okay, but it can definitely be done better. Okay, so let's have a look at what this looks like when it's being done better and when the relationships are more clear. Because more chunking means less crazy arrows going everywhere, which actually means it should be easier to follow because there's just less crazy arrows going everywhere, okay? The information is still the same, it's just that it comes later on in the branching, okay? It's not like we're getting rid of a Russian doll. We're not getting rid of this. We're just putting it inside another one. We're putting it later, okay? It's not like we're getting rid of our stationery. We're just putting it inside another box that we need to unpack. So instead of the mind map looking like point going out to 1, 2, 3, 4, it would look like point going out to 1 point, then 2 points, and then these 2 points would have 2 each. So if this is point number 1, 2, 3, and 4, you still have point number 1, 2, 3, and 4. However, you can see even in this actually looks more chaotic than this. It looks like there's more organization here. And especially if you've got heaps of different connections going everywhere, this can get very confusing very fast. So you want to make sure you've got as much chunking as possible. So I've gone ahead and done that already for this topic. This is exactly the same topic as this. But you can see how very different this mind map looks compared to this mind map. So here, it's a little bit easier to follow the arrows. We can see that there are 3 things coming off of here. We can see this kind of structure and it flows like this. You can see that I said you can split anatomy into 2 chunks. I've done that right here, 2 chunks in anatomy. And I've arranged it like this. You can see that all the stuff in green is stuff that wasn't in the original mind map. These are my new chunks. So I formed all these new chunks, here, 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 here. All of these things are new chunks that I formed. And that's allowed me to rearrange the information very differently so that it makes a lot more sense and the relationships are much more clear. And because I have actually looked at all of this information and I've thought, okay, what is the most important thing here? I've asked myself that question. I've really asked myself, what is it that is the most important? Now, what is the second most important? What's the third most important? And how do they all relate to each other? I've asked myself that question again. Okay? I've asked myself that question again. And that is this here. This is the skin step. Going from this mind map to this mind map. That is the skin step. So what am I doing? I'm asking myself these questions in order to make it more clear. And in asking myself what's most important, I'm able to categorize my relationships as some being more important than others. I'm weighing my ideas and I'm reaching that level 6 evaluation here, okay? So you can see there's an evaluation. I've evaluated that anatomy, physiology, and regulation are 3 important concepts. I've evaluated that this pathway is very important. You can see based on the thickness of the arrows. I've evaluated that this is important. I've evaluated that this is important. But this is less important than this. So now, instead of it being all, potentially the same level of importance as you might see from this mind map, or you might be led to believe, actually, now our knowledge is at a higher level. So this person's knowledge is at a level, hopefully you can guess it, this person's level 5, okay, or maybe between 4 and 5. And then here, the knowledge is at a level 6, okay? So it's a higher level of learning, and this is much more efficient. So this is what the skin step allows you to do. And you get a massive, and let me say, a massive retention increase once you do this. And the thing is, you don't have to do the skin step straight away. You can do this, and you can actually do this maybe 1 week later. It can actually be a revision activity for you. You can try to do this from pure recall, right? We can add recall, active, full, pure recall into this, and that becomes a really great revision activity that even increases your level of mastery. This is way better than doing a practice question or just rereading your notes. But I mean, I'm almost offended to assume that someone would think that rereading and rewriting notes would be even close to as efficient as doing something like this. Okay, so you could do this a week later, or you can do it straight away. You can do this, look at this, and straight away, 10 minutes later, try to do something like this. So it's very flexible. As long as you're following the steps, you're gonna get that learning, no matter when you do it. Okay, so this is how the skin step works in relation to this amazing phenomenon, which is called chunking. And chunking is something that, again, it's very easy to do as soon as you just see how to create these relationships. And once you start seeing that, you can't unsee it. You can't unsee it. And it becomes very, very easy to do. It's extremely achievable. But maybe most importantly, it's not risky at all. There's nothing to lose. There's only things to gain. So that's chunking, and that's your introduction to the skin step. So we'll go into more specifics around each individual step soon. Well done for getting this far. It's amazing. You're probably able to look back and think about how you used to study and what you used to think about learning, and then compare that to what you know now and how you study now. I'm sure it's a huge transformative change, and you're definitely, if you haven't felt the efficiency gains already, you certainly will once you actually start making this a habit and once it becomes automatic. And remember, students that are able to get this on autopilot, they often say it's harder to not do this than to do it. And that's when you know that you've already hit the efficiency jackpot. Now, I feel like you're ready by this stage. If you're comfortable with everything that we've gone through so far and you're ready to learn how to really tweak it up, you're ready to learn about grind maps. Grind maps this is my own checklist for how to make sure that your mind map that you get at the end of the skin step is as good as it can be. Okay, so we've already covered the principles of effective note taking, which, remember, is the VP Ref RE. That's true across all different types of notes. When we look at mind maps specifically, we know that there is a very specific and technical way to do mind maps to really bring about their true impact and effect. And so there's actually a more specific checklist that we can use to evaluate the mind maps themselves. Okay, so if it fulfills this checklist, we know that the mind map is of a high quality. Your mind map after your shoot stage probably is not going to be this good, but we want to get it to this point after the skin step. Okay, so by the skin step, we want to make our mind map fulfill this, and we want to turn it from a mind map into a grind map. So let's look at what grind maps are and what grind stands for. So the G stands for grouped. What does grouped mean? What we mean with grouped is that there is lots of chunking, okay? Lots of chunking. Why didn't I call it chunking if it's already chunking? The reason actually is because I used to teach grind maps before I taught about chunking, because I just thought that was a better way to teach it, and calling it chunks is a bit like harder to understand, whereas group is a word that people understand a little bit more easily. But now, these days, I teach chunking first, but also it doesn't sound as good to call it a grind map, and so that's purely the reason why it's a G instead of a C there. So G stands for grouped, which is exactly the same thing as saying we've got lots and lots of chunking. The R stands for reflective. And what we're looking for here is really the same thing with our VP Ref RE. It's the same R reflective there. What we're talking about here is that you can see elements of order control. Okay, you can see that the way that they've learned it, the relationships they've formed. Okay, so the relationships that have been formed, the logic that has been built, the concepts and how they've been arranged, the important details and how they've been added on to the concepts and how they lead on to the logic. It shows that this person has built something based on the layers of learning. It goes from the layers of learning up. Okay, and in order to do that, obviously you need order control to be able to do that. Otherwise, you're normally given the details first, right? So in order to ignore the details first and focus on the logic, you obviously need to exercise order control. So that's what we're looking at in reflective. We're saying, is it reflective of a good learning process? Is it reflective of a good learning process? And a good learning process has relationships, layers of learning, and order control visible there. So if you see a mind map which is just like, looks like this, okay, if it looks like this, like a family tree almost, what does this mean? Okay, is there good chunking? Yeah, there is. It's grouped. However, does it show order control? Probably not, because probably in the textbook, this was heading number 1, these were headings number 2 and number 3. These were subheadings number 4, and then 5, and then 6, and then 7. And these were probably the terminology, and this is probably the definitions and the examples for them. So you can see in this way, it was actually still pretty linear, and it probably isn't in the way that makes the most sense for them in their mind. So this kind of shape of learning is what I call an information hierarchy. And it's very common when people start doing mind maps to create information hierarchies. And this is because they haven't done order control. They haven't focused on learning it in the layers of learning. Instead, what they've done is they've simply just taken headings and just grouped them under the headings without really thinking about it any further. And often with students that create information hierarchies, they are not asking the question of, why is it important? Okay, this question is often very much so missing. But in some instances, this question is not missing. And I want to briefly touch on what that means. So there are 2 ways of saying that something is important. Okay, remember, why is it important? This creates logic, and logic is cause and effect. There's actually 2 directions in which we can infer logic, and one of them is actually called reverse causality, which seems like it's logical, but it's actually a logical fallacy. It doesn't make sense. So this is what I mean. You can't say that something is important because it creates an effect. You can't say it's important because it creates an effect, because it doesn't explain why it exists in the first place. So here's an example. We're using just, like common everyday sort of stuff, okay? If I drop my pen and it hits the floor to make a sound, I can't say that it was important for me to drop my pen because it will make a sound. I can't say that because a sound is made, the pen needs to be dropped. This is reverse causality. It's justifying the cause by the effect. So this arrow gets turned around, and we can't do this. So let's take an example with something like biology. In biology, inside a cell, there is this thing called a nucleus. And inside the nucleus, we have our very well-known DNA. Now, in order for DNA to be replicated, or in order for DNA to turn into a protein, which could dictate our eye color, it might dictate our muscle development, it might allow us to respond to stress, all of these things that the cell can do, fight off infection, develop immunity. It might tell us what color our hair is. All of these things, these are actually dictated by proteins. And so for the protein to be formed, it needs to be created based on what the DNA tells it to create. So this carries all the instructions for the protein to be created. It's like the assembly guide, and the assembly guide is read by all the workers inside the cell in order to create this protein. But this DNA is extremely valuable. You've only got one of these in the cell. If this were to just go outside of this preciously well-enclosed nucleus that protects it and keeps it safe, and it enters into the dangerous world of the rest of the cell, which is called the cytoplasm. If it were to enter the cytoplasm, there are enzymes and molecules floating around that could damage this DNA and do it harm, and then our only copy of our instruction manual has been destroyed or damaged, and that's not good. So actually, instead, what it does is that the DNA creates a copy of itself. It creates a little copy, and that copy is the thing that gets sent outside. So even if this copy gets damaged, it's all good. It's all good. We just make another copy. Okay, it's all good. It might make the protein here wrong the very first time, but it's fine. It just means it will create a new one. And so that copy gets sent outside, and then our enzymes and other proteins will act on it, and it will, produce this protein, and good. We've got the right eye color that we needed. We've got the right hair color that we needed. We responded to stress or immunity in the right way. All of that's all good. We're all good now. So this messenger, this copy here, this is actually called mRNA. Okay, this is called mRNA, and this is DNA. So if we have the question, why is it important to create mRNA? The reason mRNA is important is because it protects the DNA. It means DNA does not have to go outside of the nucleus. It stays safe and hidden, because if the mRNA goes out and it gets destroyed, it doesn't matter, right? That's why it's important. Reverse causality would say mRNA is important because it allows the protein to be formed. That's reverse causality. What happens is mRNA, yes, the instructions are read, and then the protein is formed. This is correct. This is a true sequence of events. This is what happens. mRNA comes out, it is read, the protein is created. So if we say, why is mRNA important? We cannot say mRNA is important because it is needed to create the protein, right? The protein is created because the mRNA instructed it to be created. That's the direction of logic. This is important because of this. This is important because of this. This is important because of protecting this, right? Not the other way around. Okay, we can't say this protein is important because it will go on to assign our eye color. Okay, so that's reverse causality, and we don't want to do that. We don't want to justify something existing because of the fact that it creates something else. Why do we not want to do that? Because it doesn't become memorable. Because that means that in order for me to remember that mRNA is important, I need to remember that it forms a protein. So that relies on me having memorized this, and I've memorized this, and therefore this actually ends up existing in isolation because it's just been memorized. It's no different from me just memorizing the process as it is. The point of asking the why is it important question is so that I can see it in terms of the bigger picture and relate it back to see what caused it in the first place. What gave rise to it? Okay, where does it come from? That's the reason that this is important. So reverse causality is an extremely common mistake that I see, especially with people that do these information hierarchies, because they think this is logical. They think they've asked themselves the why is it important question, but they've said this is important because it needs to give rise to this and this. No, these two exist because of this. This exists because of this. Okay, and when you look at it that way, this type of structure often doesn't make sense because it's basically just requiring you to memorize all of these things down here and then memorize how it's branching and then memorize this. So even though the chunking is done well and will make it easier to memorize, okay, so chunking is good, therefore memorization is easier, it actually isn't as easy as it could be because the relationships are not logical. And so in this case, it didn't reflect the right layers of learning or the right order control. A little bit tricky, I know, but I think at this stage, you'll be able to wrap your head around this. And if I try to explain this to you, when you first started this course, your brain will probably explode. But this is what the reflective means. The I stands for interconnected. Okay, the I stands for interconnected. And what that means is that if we have a mind map that looks like this, okay, mind map that looks like this, not only does it branch outwards like this, but also we can see relationships between some of these points as well. They're connected horizontally as well as vertically. They're connected horizontally as well as vertically. Okay, so things aren't just branching out. We're not just chunking and getting, organization inside organization. We're also seeing how different ideas interact and influence each other. Okay, what does this do? This increases our ability to analyze and evaluate different ideas against each other. And obviously, it increases the number of connections. We don't want to just randomly interconnect everything, okay? We want to make sure that we're only interconnecting the stuff that's actually really important. We don't want to be like, oh, this word is here. Oh, this word is here as well. Boom, connected. We don't want to do that. We want to say that it actually is logical. There is an actual sort of cause and effect relationship here, okay? So don't just chuck in random arrows everywhere just for the sake of it. Put in arrows that you think are actually meaningful, that help you understand the topic a little bit better. Okay, so that's what interconnected means. The N stands for non-verbal, which means that we're doing more doodles. We're trying to make them abstract. Okay, we're not just relying on words. And the reason that that's important is because, number one, words take up more space. Okay, therefore, it's just harder to see what's going on because there's just more stuff on the page. And number two is because, as we've already covered, doodles and abstract stuff uses a different part of your brain that normally isn't used. And that actually directly increases our retention. The D stands for directional. Directional means that we have achieved level 5, the evaluate stage. Directional means there is a direction to the information. So instead of the mind map just being like this, it's more like this. Like that. So you can see there is a direction. There is a flow of ideas, okay? So directionality really tests whether things are logical, because logic is remember, cause and effect. So this arrow here, that's what gives directionality to the mind map. You can only get directionality when you think, what is more important than others? We can only get it when we start weighing and critiquing the ideas and seeing how it all contributes to a greater picture. This is what gives your mind map more purpose. So your original mind map before your skin step, you might think you've got all the ideas. Then you need to ask yourself, right? We should know what we're asking ourselves. We're asking ourselves, why is it important? And we ask ourselves, why is it important? We're kind of thinking about, what is the purpose of it? Why did it need to be there? And that purpose gives you its causes and effects. And that allows you to create a mind map that just feels like it's just going somewhere. The information is more purposeful. Okay? And the E stands for emphasized. Emphasized is also a sign of evaluation. What emphasized means is that the main connections, okay, main concepts, main relationships okay, slash arrows, are visually clearer to see. And this could just be bigger font, bigger lines, lines that are stylized. So instead of just having something that looks like this, we have something that looks like this and this. So you can see straight away that the second one, this actually looks more memorable. And the reason that we want to have this emphasize step in here is because it forces us to critique and evaluate and weigh up which connections, which relationships are the most important. Okay, and it forces us to be at that level 5. All right, so this is the checklist for a good mind map at the skin step. This is a grind map. Okay, really quickly, let's have a look at the mind map that I did before, the one on cardiovascular system, just to see, does it fulfill the grind map? Have I skinned it enough, do you think? Do you think I did a good job skinning this? Okay, if it fulfills the grind map, I've skinned it enough. All right, is it grouped? Let's check that. Do we think it's sufficiently grouped? We're looking for areas that have lots of branches coming off any individual point. Okay, 4 or more branches at any individual point. Okay, this is all looking good. Here, this can be grouped more. And indeed, I actually did get a little bit lazy here. So overall, is it grouped? Pretty good, but this area should have maybe more chunking, So maybe I should have divided that up into maybe 3. I can probably divide that into about 3 different groups. Okay, cool. So that's what I could improve on. Is it reflective? Does it reflect order control? Does it reflect logic and layers of learning? Okay, well, I can clearly see a backbone here, right? There's a backbone of learning there. This stuff here has less of a backbone, but it's because they are more minor points. And I can see that these, the order here in learning this stuff first before getting into this stuff. And actually, one thing that I tend to see, which I'm not going to create as a hard and fast rule of mind maps, but it's kind of like an artifact, a side effect of what happens when there is good order control when you're doing the mind map, is you tend to see a skew. And what I mean by a skew is actually, you can actually see this here, is that you can see that this part here actually looks kind of more neat. And this stuff here seems a little bit more kind of, you can kind of tell that this came first and then this came after. That's actually normal. And I actually think that's a good sign because it means that the main connections were prioritized first and the backbone was built first. So what I did when I did this is I drew this, and then I drew this, and then this. The next thing I did is I drew this, and then some of these things, and then I went out onto here, and then afterwards I then added on this bit, and then this bit here. So this skew shows that it's kind of going in this direction. And that's actually because the mind map starts at the core and builds outwards, okay, rather than being really detailed and being really detailed. So the skew actually ends up being sort of the side effect of something that did have good order control, okay? It's like one of those little things that I've picked up over the years. So is it reflective of having good order control and layers of learning? Yes, it is. Is it interconnected? Yes. Look, this is very interconnected. We can see lots of interconnections between things. We can see how all the information really connects with each other. Okay, so very interconnected. Is it non-verbal? Have I used images and diagrams? I've used a couple, okay, this kind of imagery here. Not a lot though. Having said that, there's not as much information on this as probably there needs to be, but I think there could be more non-verbal expression. Okay, so that's something that I might want to look at. Is there anything here that I can express without needing to write the word? There probably is. Yep, this stuff here. I can probably express this stuff here without using these words. I can definitely express this without using the words. Yeah, and actually there was in the original one, it just hasn't copied into here. There was actually a little diagram here as well that looked like that, and that is good nonverbal use as well. Is it directional? Yes, there's clearly direction going on. You can see flow of information. It's not just branching out. You can actually tell that the information seems to have a purpose for existing. And is it emphasized? Yes, these main connections have been emphasized. I could emphasize, in fact, I should emphasize this a little bit more in terms of actually making the font a little bit thicker, a little bit bolder. I might want to make it look a little bit fancier even, make it a different color, just to make it pop out a little bit more. So I think that could be improved more. So has this been skinned enough? I would say that this is, at the moment, it's like 90% there. I could skin it a little bit more, okay, and take it to another 10%. And this is another reason why using digital mind maps with an infinite canvas is so much better, because it's a pain to redo the entire thing just to make some of these adjustments, whereas on the tablet it's pretty easy for me to rub it out and then just do it again. Okay, likewise for here, I could just get rid of this and then just do it again. So that's the grind map checklist applied to the post skin mind map that I did. Does it pass my grind map seal of approval? Yes, I'm going to pass at 90%. So now we're going to skin this mind map on asexual reproduction, which we started off with the aim step here, asking those good questions, building a basic backbone, applying the concepts onto that backbone, and now we're looking at how we can clean it up. So when we look at the skin step, we can see that there are these areas where more chunking can occur, right? There's 4 branches here. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 branches coming off of this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 branches coming off of this, 4 branches coming off of this, and 4 branches coming off of this. So all of these areas, I think we can chunk it more, because as it is now, just in this stage, it's still going to be quite hard to remember. It will be more memorable than linear notes. However, it's still not going to be as good as a mind map really should be. So let's go and turn this into a grind map by increasing our chunking and making our relationships just much more clear. So there's certain areas like this connection here. This is quite hard to remember because you can see it's kind of dodging in between the gap here. It's just not as memorable. So really, from a spatial awareness point of view, I'm going to want to bring this thing about nuclear transfer. I want to bring this nuclear transfer point somewhere around here so that the connection is not so long and arduous. And I might rearrange a few of the other things as I chunk them into different types of categories. Now, remember that, again, there is stuff that is not on this mind map at the moment that we will have in flashcards or other memorization aids. So for now, we can use flashcards or any other memorization tools you want to use. We will cover this in the later camps. However, for now, you can just rely on using your flashcards until we cover those guidelines. But this is about, I would say, around 90% of what is needed to be known in this topic. And the remaining 10% would go in as that rote learning memorization. So let's go ahead and skin this. And after we've done that, this is what the mind map looks like. So you can see how different it looks. But I want you to see, number one, how much cleaner and how much more it flows, okay? You can see how much more it flows, okay? So if we compare them back to back, we can see on this one, there are connections, but it's hard to see the general direction as much, and it does seem like it's very hedgehoggy, right? Like just spikes coming off of each individual point. Whereas here, it seems like there's a little bit more organization, right? So I've divided those different types, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I've divided those 5 types into 3 different groups. And these are not official groups. They're just ways that make sense for me. So I thought we've got groups that are splitting, basically, which is like fission or fragmentation. And then we've got groups that are like, it's kind of like traveling, like spores or budding. So these are just ways that I've organized it in my mind. You can see I've got little things here to remind me to make this point more memorable. And this type of stuff is always very good from a visual point of view. It just makes it pop and stick in your memory a little bit more easily. We did move nuclear transfer over here as well, and to connect it to the failure rate idea. And we've made the advantages and disadvantages basically 3 different advantages with a few examples, and 3 disadvantages as well with some other examples, which is a simplification from the original one where we had all these advantages separately and then the disadvantages coming off like this. It's much cleaner to look at, and it just looks like it's much simpler and more manageable. So this is that whole subject. And again, it's got exactly the same amount of detail as this one did, but straight away you can see which one is cleaner and simpler, where this one, the relationships, you can tell are much better. So if you're familiar with this topic, you can pause this here and have a look at this and compare all the different changes that have been made in the skin step compared to the original mind map here. If you pay attention, you'll see that all of these areas have actually been chunked and organized a little bit better. So maybe you can just pause this, have a look at how you might chunk these areas, and then compare that to how I have chunked these in here. So you can see the chunking here, here, here. In fact, this is a good point here, is that I've actually got overlapping chunks. So I've actually chunked cloning into plants and animal type techniques. And I've actually chunked this area as well again into lab techniques, 1, 2, and 3, whereas these are not lab techniques. So I've actually chunked it 2 different ways, which is not something that you can do often, but I did see an opportunity for it. And when you do see an opportunity for it, it does add a different dimension to the relationships. So it is quite a handy thing to keep in mind, is that sometimes you can find multiple types of patterns, right? So there's that trigger word right now. What we're doing is we're looking at creating patterns, right? And that's checking that box in our mind based on that cave theory. So I could find a pattern between some of these things that allowed me to group it like plants, but I also found a pattern between these things, which allowed me to group it in terms of lab techniques. So I did both. I grouped it in terms of plants versus animals, but I also grouped it in terms of lab versus not lab techniques. Okay, so this is another way that we can organize it. So we've taken this example of the blood system. We went from the aim step, which we're familiar with now. We've gone to the shoot step. We started with the building a basic structure, and that was so important. This is very important, right? And then we got a more detailed structure, adding on some of the more detailed concepts, but not all the details. And then we went through and added on all those important details. Now, at this point, I'm still missing some of the things I really need to memorize. There are certain things that I need to put on flashcards, okay? And that stuff will come later, and I'll talk about flashcards later as well. For now, you can use flashcards or whatever other way of memorization you're comfortable with. But for me, I just chucked it on flashcards. So this covers around about 95% of everything I need to know. There's a few things that I haven't put on there that would be on flashcards though. So now let's look at how we can skin this and actually create those better relationships. So if we look at the mind map, we can see that there are areas that there are a lot of connections and it's a bit messy. Specifically around control, we can see that there's these arrows that don't look very clean. It's hard to kind of make out what's going on here. And this arrow crossing is not going to be as memorable, okay? Crossing arrows is generally something that we want to avoid. So let's simply just rearrange this and increase our chunking and see if we can chunk some of this stuff together. See if we can just space it out a little bit more so the arrows are a little bit cleaner, because remember, arrows represent relationships and relationships are the key. So when we make arrows clearer, we're really prioritizing our relationships. Same thing's going to go here. And let's say, okay, this area here as well, actually, this is a bit messy. This whole area can probably be cleaned up a bit. So I'm going to go through this and I'm going to see which areas can I clean up and how can I make it just overall look a little bit neater, where the main flow of ideas is just easier to see, because at the moment it's hard to see the main flow. We can tell it's really connected, but it is a little bit messy. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to examine this. I'm going to see what can I chunk. I'm going to see, is there a different way that I can express things, an image that I can use? Is there a simpler way that I can make this? And often when we skin it, we'll realize that there are things that we might have written down initially that by now are so obvious to us that we know we're never going to forget it. So we can actually just remove it. So for example, this capillaries, I've written here that it's the smallest vessel. But by the time I finish studying this, the fact that capillaries are the smallest is extremely obvious. And anyone who studied this subject will know that's not something that you're likely to forget.
So, the other thing like arteries taking blood away from the heart, that's not something that you're likely to forget if you've learned it with this type of relationship. So now, after I've skinned it, this is what the mind map looks like. So you can see it looks very different. And I want you to notice how much simpler it looks, okay? So this is exactly the same mind map. There is exactly the same amount of information on this, okay? This single mind map, or rather, this is at this point, this is a grind map, okay? This is a grind map, and I can study approved grind map. You can see that the main relationships are very clear. The arrows are very prominent. We can see the directionality of the topic. It's actually got all the core components of the original mind map, but look at how much cleaner that is. And that is actually exactly the same, okay? And now compared to that, and that has all the information on there. Again, 90 to 95%. So look at that mind map. Look how clean it is. So again, if you're familiar with this topic, feel free to freeze this frame and compare it to the previous one, which was here. And you'll see that truly everything is still the same structure. So again, we've still got the heart, this cycle. I've decided to represent certain concepts differently. This messy area with the whole exchange thing going on there, and the pressure drop and the surface area increase around the capillaries. This area here was this area. So you can see, look, capillaries are involved in exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. Surface area increases a lot because there's lots of branches. Pressure goes down and it's slower. There are pores and it's single-celled, which allow it to function in this exchange. So look at that. Do you see exactly the same thing? Capillaries, I've removed the fact that it's the smallest. It's one cell, there's pores. It functions in exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. The pressure is going down as the surface area increases, as the number of branches increases as well. So look, we've got all that same detail, right? So by doing this and increasing the chunking, and you'll notice that there are areas of better chunking. There's better chunking over here when it comes to coronary heart disease. There's better chunking when it comes over here to the control aspect. And you'll also notice that I've got more pictures. I've got little things like that that just make it more memorable. So it just pops out and sticks out of the page a little bit easier. Got a little man here exercising, little fight or flight response diagram here. So these types of little diagrams, they really help to just make things look simpler because I don't have to write so many words, and it just makes the overall thing look cleaner as well. I've used another technique here where you can see where I've said diastole, which is relaxation. I've drawn like a little sun inside the D. So I can imagine like a sunny diastole to help me realize that it's a sunny, relaxing day or something like that, that allows me to remember this. Now, remember again, there is stuff here that needs to be, well, not on here necessarily, but there's other stuff that's not included in this mind map that does need to go into flashcards or another memorization tool, which again, we will cover pretty shortly. But for now, you can just put them on flashcards, digital flashcards preferably. So things like this cardiac cycle, learning about what happens to each valve in the cardiac cycle. This is something that I might have in a flashcard. It's a very specific detail. There are certain little details on this that I might put onto flashcards, but honestly, I don't feel the need to put a lot of it. Maybe just a couple things here, a couple things here, literally 2 or 3 things here, but the rest of it is basic enough that I'm very, very comfortable with it. So that's how we've taken our understanding from an aim step all the way through shoot, and then we've skinned it. So hopefully we can see how this very clean, extremely relational, simple understanding of quite a complex topic with all the details has been built from that aim step. So by the end of the shoot step for the chemistry area of study number 1, we got this mind map, 2 mind maps. Now we're going to skin this. So we can look straight away that now the first one here, honestly, I feel like this is pretty well done. I don't see too many multiple branches. It looks relatively clean and pretty simple. So I'm actually happy with this. But this one is messy, okay? And we can see that there are all these areas here that are messy. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rearrange these so it makes more sense. I'm going to put the hydrogen bonds probably somewhere out here so that it's not like overlapping with all these lines. Generally, having lines intersecting like this is not good. That's a no-no because it's much harder to remember and it looks more confusing. This connection here is just impossible to remember because it's dodging through everything. This is not relationships being prioritized. So I'm going to prioritize the relationships, clean it up, make this a separate point in itself coming off of here, because now I'm seeing different patterns. I'm seeing different ways to represent this. So let's go and rearrange that. And what that looks like now is this. So look at how much cleaner that looks, okay? The first one above versus this one. Straight away, you can see that this is a topic with lots of organization, okay? Lots of organization. And you can see I've used a technique here where I've represented hydrogen bonds as this dumbbell for the H to remind myself that it's strong, And by doing that, I can not have to write down that it's strong because I've represented the idea that it's strong through the image, okay? I've added a little ice drawing here to represent that water can be used as a coolant. And you can see I've rearranged the material here in terms of polar hydrogen bonds, solute-solvent interactions. So this relationship between structure, solute-solvent interactions, which I had already planned out all the way here, right? Solvent, structure, solute-solvent interactions. That has maintained exactly. But the first way I did it, I realized I didn't really do it well. I didn't plan my use of space very well, which is why the second time when I fixed it up, it retains that very clean image. And now the relationships are very, very clear to see. And it has exactly all the information that I need, minus maybe about 5%, 10% in terms of definitions, the specific equations and formulas and constants and things like that, which I can just go through and memorize very easily. So that's the skinned version, and you can see how clean that is. So have a look at this one and compare that to the original one we had over here, and just look at how I have changed it and how I have chunked it differently, how I've rearranged it in space, okay? So we're looking at changes in the way I've arranged it in space and the changes in the way I've done the chunking to really differentiate the information, organize it a lot more, and just make the relationships much clearer. Well, how do we skin this 1984 mind map? We've gone from themes to the reasons why, and then we've connected that to the examples and the techniques. So in skinning, the idea obviously is to consolidate the information. We're looking for patterns. We're looking for types of examples or techniques that we can all relate back to a certain thing, a singular point, something that's easier for us to work with. Now, the thing here is that now I've learned English in high school, obviously. I've also taken English at a university level, and I've also published papers as well. So I have a relatively decent exposure to English across all levels. The thing is that actually at a high school level, across all curriculums, you never really needed to develop your ability to analyze English beyond what you'd actually get from a shoot stage. So it's not actually necessary to go beyond that in terms of knowing it deeper than what you'd get from this. But what is relevant instead is being able to put this information into an essay and use this information in different ways. So that's what I actually want to focus on, is in the skin step for English. And this is quite a subject-specific thing, in that the skin step for English, our goal here is to consolidate by hitting it from different angles. And we want to use the information, okay, in different ways. What we want is we want to be comfortable with the themes. We want to be comfortable with rationalizing why those themes are important, okay, the rationale. We want to be comfortable with linking those themes to the techniques. And we want to be comfortable with doing that for multiple different ways, okay, different types of consolidation. And so here we come back to Kolb's experiential learning cycle, the experience, the reflection, the abstraction, and the experimentation of it. And this is really what the skin step is that we're going to be doing lots of different essays. We're going to be writing different types of questions, using the information in different ways, and really looking for ways that we can put these themes and techniques together in ways that we normally wouldn't have thought of.
This is not something that is easy to save time. In fact, you can't really save time on this. It actually relies on you having done the shoot step properly in order for the skin step to go well. But what we're really doing here is we are legitimately, at this point, going to be doing practice essays with different practice questions. So this should be very familiar to you. The difference is that we did the shoot step a little bit differently. We did the aim step a little bit differently to how you're used to. But at this point, we are doing the good old-fashioned, what you're used to in terms of practice essays. But the reason that this is now more effective is because instead of doing practice essays alone and blindly trying to improve, what we're actually doing is we're doing a practice essay. We're reflecting on how well that was able to connect the techniques to the themes, or rather display the themes and connect the techniques to them. And then we're going to abstract on different types of approaches that we could take. So what I recommend here is not only to write your own practice essays, but also to analyze other exemplar practice essays that you might be able to find. And usually if you're studying a text at school, it's a famous text and there are literally like hundreds, if not thousands of practice essays, exemplar essays that you can read. And what you want to do is look for how other people have managed to communicate this. So you are basically revising this, but in essay form, and you're getting more used to just making these connections, making different types of connections, rearranging them in different orders, and just building that skill and finding different ways that other people might have thought of, which can just overall consolidate your knowledge. So not a lot to explain here. This part you'll feel is much easier and more effective if you've done the shoot step well, even if it's technically very similar to the technique that you used before, because of the fact that we've changed the background, everything that we've done before that by quite a lot. The benefit of doing practice essays at this stage changes by quite a lot as well. So how do we skin this? How do we skin this? We have identified a list of techniques, but we did that after identifying a list of themes. And then we found the techniques and related it to the themes as we went. So everything we learned already from the get-go had a purpose. The technique had a purpose. And we already directly linked that through to the agenda. Look at that. Look at that. We already built the map. So what are we doing with the skin step? In the skin step, we're going to consolidate. We're going to consolidate that knowledge to make it something that's easier for us to work with. If we're going to pump out an essay, we want it to be easier to work with. So how do we make this easier to work with? Well, let's write out this list of themes that we had a little bit differently. Okay, so we've got the idea of better, okay, good, happy. We've got the idea of cooperation. We've got the idea of local and relatable. We have the idea of it just being a positive change. We have the idea of us being appreciated. We have the idea of them being unique, them being honest, and this change, this positive change being like obvious, and that it's like common. So, okay, these are some of the things that we had. And in fact, actually, I think the obvious was relating to the fact that it's obvious that they are local, that they're relatable, and that they are cooperative, and that they appreciate you. I think that's what they were trying to be obvious. But actually, they also try to make it obvious in other periods of the text that it's obvious that this is a better thing. So now what we're going to do is we're going to find patterns between these words. So let's say, look, better, good, happy, positive change. So these things are all kind of like, they're sort of the same thing. So I'm going to just talk about that as a single word, positive change. Positive change. I'm going to take, let's look at another one. I think the idea of them being honest and appreciating you, and them being local and relatable and cooperative. I think that's all kind of also the same kind of general idea, which is the idea of, let's think of a word that we can use to kind of bring all of that together. Maybe we could describe all of those as being like customer first. Okay, customer first. Or like customer valuing, maybe. It doesn't really matter. It's not super important. We're just trying to find something that we can pin it to. And then the idea of this being an obvious and a common change that's occurring, I think that's actually an important theme that they do mention a few times. So I'm going to put that here as well. The idea that this is like in a way like normal. This is normal. Okay. So now we've taken all of these themes and we've distilled them into just 3 different things. So if the essay were to ask you to analyze the persuasive literary techniques that are used in this article, and why, or justify that, or what the purpose of it, whatever it is, then we would actually simply be able to say, based on this, we'd say, okay, well, the reason that they're doing this is because of their agenda, obviously, and the way that they're representing all of this is through the same list of techniques, the techniques that we would have identified here, these sorts of things. So we've got all those same techniques. So our essay then is very simple. We simply start from here and we move to introduce these points, and then we start at the first point, and then we rationalize it using the techniques we have. So we would say, this is an article that is actually a paid advertisement written by Haley's local store, which is clearly trying to portray their recent cashless digital change as something that is positive and centered around their customer first, customer valuing business philosophy, which they have attempted to normalize to the Australian audience. The positive change can be seen through the usage of techniques such as the very positive photo with the handshake, as well as repetition in the title, as well as other areas of repetition and rhetorical questioning, reinforcing, for example, why did we do these things, followed by an emphasized statement that shows that they are customer serving. Meanwhile, we can see that there's credibility given to the statement of its normality and how positive this change is, with the juxtaposition of statistics being used directly in contrast with value-driven words such as recent pickpocketing and easier and safer in reference to going cashless. Something like that. Like, I'm literally just making this up on the spot, okay? But the idea is that it's very systematic. All we're doing is we're saying in the essay, this is their agenda, and this is how they've decided to, these are the things that they're trying to push across. And the ways that they are doing this first one is that they're using this technique, for example, here and then here and then here. And then we just have to link that. And that's a technical skill. Okay. So doing this and making it sound good, that's a technical skill. You need to practice that. Linking this, that link, that's a technical skill. You need to practice that. But in terms of what you are linking, what you are saying, and your ability to really critically analyze to figure out the techniques highly accurately and extremely systematically, that's the same. That's the same. So let's have a look at how we can actually do this entire process. And I'm going to show you from including the aim, shoot, and skin for a different type of question so that you can see how this works for types of unfamiliar or like analysis that are considered curveballs. So this is a question that has come up recently at the time of recording this, and it was even in the news because students were like bewildered that such a question could come up because it was considered too difficult. But let's see how easy it is when we apply a simple BHS system to this. So first of all, we're asking ourselves, what are the main themes on here and why is it important? So first of all, what are the themes that we can see? So when we're looking at this, we're simply going to draw out the themes. What do you notice here? I notice a smiling person, okay? I notice the pencil, okay? There's a pencil here. I notice there's a sun here. I notice the birds here. Let's try to think about what sort of themes this are. Okay, this smiling person, that's like a very positive thing here. The pencil, I think that kind of references like studying or a student or something like that, maybe. You've got these birds here with the word flew on them, and maybe they look kind of free. Okay, they look like freedom. You've got clouds here. Okay, the clouds, which have the word softly on them. And then you've got the sun here with like honey, stay. So these are very safe kind of words. So not only is there a sense of positivity, there is actually like a sense of calm, a sense of like comfort that's given there, right? And then we've got the waves. We've got the waves underneath the bottom. What does that look like? Well, I'm noticing that
that there are words down here that are both positive and negative. Like we've got words like tiptoe, which is like quite a careful sort of word. We've got words like plunge, which is, can be seen as kind of like scary a little bit. Fathom, which is like almost like overwhelming kind of word. Echo makes it feel like empty or like very, very large. Million, that's just like a big word. Below, something that's underneath. So the theme that I'm getting with all of these words underneath here. Okay, plummet, that as well. Let's see if we can find any other words here. Even like that's like an expression of like, it's like an expression of like almost surprise. So what we're getting here is that we're getting a bunch of words that indicate that there's unknown, like more in the depth, an unknown depth. There's something there that's big, that's wide, that's unknown, that might be even potentially scary. That's the kind of feeling that we're getting from these words. So that's another theme, okay? That's another theme. And then in the top side of here, we've got things like once, we've got sigh, why, wake, wander, meander. Okay, so there are these words that are like why, wander, meander. So these are words of like almost uncertainty. Someone that's kind of like lost. So we have now actually a very interesting thing that we're seeing here, right? So we see that there's like all these positive things up here, and then we've got some slightly like almost ambiguous, weird, negative things over here, and then we've got like confused, lost stuff in the middle. Okay, we've got like positive going to kind of like maybe sort of like negative, confusing, and then we've got like just lost, like what's going on in the middle. Interesting, right? Now, why are these themes important? In this example, we don't have anything about the artist. We don't know anything about the artist. We don't know where they're coming from. There might have been more information in the actual original text, but from what we can see, we don't have enough information to know why these themes were important. But I'm willing to bet that this is a person who has something to do with education or maybe writing, based on the fact that they've got a pencil here. And I'm willing to bet that there's someone who maybe has gone through some of these different emotions, and that's something that's really personal to them. Okay? But we don't have enough information to answer this comprehensively. So we're going to give that like a squiggly line to say that we can't really do that one. All right, now how do the techniques that are used relate to the themes? Well, we've already kind of done that, right? In trying to figure out what the themes are. We've seen certain techniques that are being used here. We saw that there was this sort of spectrum, okay, from top to bottom. I would say that's one technique. We've got the idea of like the waves being made up of like words, the usage of actual words to represent emotions. I can also see that like the colors up here are a little bit brighter, so there's some colors being used. And I can see a smiley face. Look, a smiley face. And I'd say that that's probably enough techniques for me to write an essay about. So if our task is now to analyze this essay, we've kind of already consolidated this by saying, okay, we've got the idea of like a student or something, a sense of like calm, confident freedom, but also this sort of theme of kind of being lost. This in a way almost becomes like the summary. This is like our skin step that we've just done. Okay, I inadvertently skipped ahead and did it. I'm sorry for that. But this basically is what we would have done in the skin step, is trying to find patterns and make it something that's a little bit easier to work with, because this is not easy to work with. This is easy to think about. So when we're analyzing this, we would say something like, this is a very interesting image depicting what seems like not only a physical journey, but potentially an emotional journey as well. The themes that are clearly represented here are a juxtaposition of positivity and freedom, giving a sense of calm confidence, compared to the unknown depths below, which are more confusing and chaotic, uncertain, and potentially even scary. We see examples of the positive, calm, comfort being seen in not only the colors that are being used, but in the visual representation of a smiling student and the birds, which look very free and have the words flew on them. We also see the clouds with the words soft, which give a feeling of comfort. However, underneath the surface of the water and making up the waves, we can also see the juxtaposition, the use of words like wake versus why, meander and wander, which give a sense of confusion, reinforced by words like sigh and the darker colors that are used there. We can see at the bottom there are more dark colors that are being used, which is well supported by words like plunge and fathom and echo, which give a sense of depth and scale and uncertainty that may be scary. This is again reinforced by words such as plummet that is seen in the transition between confusion through to that unknown depth. Okay, something like that. So do you see when we apply the same thing, the skill is being able to make it kind of fluent and flow along. But the practice that we need to do is in being able to develop the eye. Developing the eye to be able to critically dissect it by using these things and going from the themes and relating it to the techniques rather than doing it the other way around. We've covered how we can do the aim and shoot for a new language based on the comprehensible input hypothesis. And we're now going to look at how we can take that all the way through to the skin step after having done this aim shoot cycle. Now, to be totally honest, the skin step is not really necessary for languages unless you're really aiming to be very, very fluent at it. But there are some things that you can do that could speed things up. And this is especially the case when it comes to reading and writing, especially if it's non-alphabetical. Like Mandarin is the best example here. Simplified Chinese or traditional Chinese, the way that the words and the characters are written, it's not alphabetical. So you have to memorize every single one, which is an extreme ordeal. So what we do with the skin step is remember that the point of the skin step is to find connections and patterns, right? We're trying to create chunks and organization with it. Now, you could do this in a mind map, and I have done this with the mind map before in the past, and it sort of works and it sort of doesn't work. I would suggest that you just experiment with using it and see if it works for you or not. The issue that I found was that it became pretty overwhelming very quickly because there's so many different connections. But having sort of little trees of characters and trees of words can help. So what does all of that mean? Let me explain a little bit more in detail. When we're skinning something, we're trying to look for connections and patterns. Well, the thing is, we need to think a little bit about the origin of languages. So have you ever realized that there are some words that sound very similar in lots of different languages? So for example, the word mum is very similar in sound across basically every single language. And then we've got words, obviously, in English that are derived from Latin and Greek. We've got words that derive from French. But then we've got French words that have derived from, other things as well, like more Eurasian or Proto-Eurasian languages. So this study of where languages and where words have come from and how it's developed over the years of human civilization, that is something which is called etymology. And when you look at the etymology of a word, then you can see where its root comes from, where it originates from. So when we think about the origin of a language, there are certain things that are the root. This is where the language comes from. And then as it grows, it starts varying. There are new branches that come out from the same root. So you could have a word, for example, the Greek word for light, which is photos. Now, photos, that Greek word, is used as part of words like, photo, photography, photometry, and actually there's a bunch of other words as well that use the word photo, which is indicative of the word light. And we can see this with actually lots of other words, is that we have elements of these words that have actually come from the same root. For something like English, this is relatively straightforward. For other languages that we're not familiar with, it can be more subtle. We may not realize that it's actually the same word that's being used again and again. In fact, even in English, there are certain words that we might not realize are roots of another word because we've only ever learnt it that first way. For example, the word commonly that we call soccer actually originates from association, which I've
spelled wrong, association of football or something. And then there was an English schoolboy slang sort of thing where someone that did that would have like a added on it. So playing this football thing as part of the association was called a soccer. And then the A was eventually dropped, and then we were left with the word soccer. So there are words like soccer where we wouldn't even know that it originated from any other word previously, but actually that is the case. So let alone in English, in a foreign language where we don't even know the words to begin with, it's very confusing where those words might come from. So we actually want to be cognizant. We want to pay attention to where those common word roots may have been and find patterns between them so that we're memorizing a little bit less. So instead of memorizing 100 different words, maybe actually what we're memorizing is like 42 different words, and then there is like a combination of those 42 different words in certain ways that make up the remaining words so that we're not just memorizing new ones, it's just a little bit easier to understand. And actually the same can be done with the writing as well. So even something that's not alphabetical, like Chinese, there's actually a reason why the characters look the way that they do. So best example for this, I think, is the Chinese character for center, which looks like this, which is basically a line going through the center or middle. However, that word put together with the word for country means the center country, and it's pronounced exactly the same way, this word plus this word, to mean China, and it's spelt this character plus this character. So that's a very simple and basic example, but you'd actually find that with a lot of words that are, compound in nature, or not necessarily compound, but maybe the characters share some certain elements between them. Maybe they remind you of something. So for example, maybe this word is related to this word, but maybe this character reminds you of something. So for example, maybe the box-looking thing on the outside, maybe that reminds you of like a boundary, which will remind you that this is the letter for country. And actually the character inside here, I'm pretty sure is actually the character for king. So it's like the king inside his country, inside his boundary, that's the country. And now we've actually remembered that. And obviously something like this is memorable enough in itself, but there might be another character that looks like a bird, and that helps you remember what it is. So what we're doing here is we're trying to find connections and patterns and ways of remembering it that can be relatively arbitrary sometimes, or can be meaningful if they legitimately do relate here. So we're trying to think, from the origin of the languages, where are the single branching points? What are the words that if I were to learn that, I would actually learn a bunch of other words as well, and it becomes a lot easier. And so what you do with this is that you simply can just go through your flashcards list, and you can do this like once a month or once every few weeks or something. Just get a list of all of your flashcards and just go through and see, are there any actually similarities that you haven't noticed between any of the words before? And you can spend half an hour to an hour doing this, and you'll generally be able to pick up a few things, or at least make certain words much more easily memorable. This, combined with active flashcard management, should allow you to remember lots of characters and lots of words a little bit more easily. But again, it is pretty situational. You're not always going to be able to find these patterns. You're not always going to be able to find this level of organization, especially in a new language, and you may simply just not have time. So at the very, very least, if you're not able to do the skin step, you should at least be doing the aim shoot cycle very vigorously. And if you get some time and a moment, especially for languages like Chinese, I would actually say it's extremely valuable for. Try to find these connections and patterns, ways that the character looks, shapes that it makes, words that are overlapping, or characters inside other characters, or radicals that seem very similar, and try to create those patterns. And this network, this connection that you draw, ends up being what your mind map is. But as I said, it can be overwhelming. Give it a go, and if you find it's manageable, good for you. If you find it's hard to manage that, then you just try to hold on to that information by making note of it some other way. Now the fact that we can flip that
ratio from a 1-to-1 ratio of just doing questions again and again, and how we can flip that to a 10-to-1 ratio where every question we're doing is actually allowing us to learn much more about that topic. And it's going to make sure that we're able to tackle every single type of question they can throw at us, because we've already thought about every type of question they can throw at us. Before we even learned about the equations, we know exactly why we're learning it. So all the learning is purposeful behind maths, which is probably very new for most people. So what can we do in the skin step? Well, the skin step, much like in English, with maths, the way that you are assessed for a math curriculum is relatively limited, which is a good thing, because maths can be extremely theoretically heavy. So the purpose of the skin step, remember, is to find patterns and consolidate relationships. What we saw when it comes to a subject like English was that what that means is we want to hit that from multiple different angles. We want to test our relationship and our understanding from as many angles as possible, so that no matter what they ask us, we're always going to be confident, because we've spent our entire revision process purely looking at that, and we haven't been locked into that 1-to-1 ratio of doing more questions in order to get good at that type of question. We're relatively comfortable with doing questions. We're relatively comfortable with calculations, and now it's more so a matter of just developing our ability a little bit more. So how do we do that? Well, the first way that we do it is very simple. It's what you're exactly used to. It's simply by practicing more questions. So here, there's no change. But the reason why it's important now, and we do it in this order, is because we have already set up our brain to learn it differently. Because it's now ready to learn differently, when we go through a lot of different types of questions and practice questions, we're able to get a lot more learning out of it. It makes a lot more sense for us. And it's more like saying, oh, this is how I think it's meant to be. Oh, yes, I was right. Or this is how I think it's meant to be. Oh, but I was wrong. Oh, so therefore I must have understood it incorrectly. So it must actually be like this. And you do another question and you're like, oh, yes, it is like that. So unlike normally when you do a practice question and you think, okay, this is what I think the answer is. Oh, I'm wrong. Why is that? Oh, it's because I have to do it this way instead. You do another question. Oh, I got it wrong. Why is that? I have to do it this way. This requires you to just like memorize a different step-by-step process for pretty much every different type of question. It's not going back to a fundamental theory. There's no hypothesis that you're testing. There's no general approach to it. It's all very almost random. Whereas when you have a really strong understanding of why you learned all of those equations, you naturally know when to apply them. So you think, oh, this type of question, I should be able to apply a combination of this equation and then this equation, and that should allow me to solve this type of problem. Does that work? Oh, it didn't work. Oh, it's because for these types of questions, I actually need to have a third element in there as well, or this element doesn't actually work. And therefore, any type of question that involves this combination, we will be able to solve because we've deepened our understanding. We've consolidated those relationships. We've found patterns between different types of questions, and we've found that certain questions are all the same in some ways. And so what that's doing is that because we know that at a high school level, we are almost never tested at this top level to create new mathematical knowledge, which is extreme. We're only ever really tested in the levels where we're trying to evaluate, analyze, and apply it, or the lower levels, understand and memorize, but mostly in the analyze, evaluate, and apply levels. We don't have to worry about getting to an extremely high level of mastery. We can simply now worry about refining our skill, practicing questions, and because we're locked in now to a Kolb's experiential learning cycle, where every question that we get wrong, we're actually learning more than just that question's worth, we should over time actually improve. Now, there's another aspect to this as well, actually, which is that by this point, there's a really easy way to tell if your maths knowledge and application, so the balance of your theoretical understanding versus your ability to apply that, your procedural skill, whether that's in good balance with each other. So whether this is too weak or whether this is too weak. It's easy to know if your procedural aspect is too weak because it simply means that when you try to do questions, you're not able to do it. That means that your procedural aspect is weak. And doing practice will help with that. And as I've mentioned time and time again, by now, when you do practice, you will improve much faster because it's actually developing and consolidating your knowledge. Whereas normally, when we do it, these two are completely separated. But there's actually another way that we can test whether our conceptual understanding of maths is right or not. And that is to not just do practice questions that you find, but that is actually to make your own. Make your own questions. So you want to make your questions as challenging as possible. And you always want it to be, okay, always, you want it to be applied. You want to always have it applied in some kind of scenario or some kind of realistic situation. So if you're learning about, let's say, trigonometry, you don't want to create questions for yourself where simply you have a triangle and then the number is like 5 versus 4 versus like, the angle here is like 88.7 degrees versus you do it again and you're like, oh, okay, well, this time I'm going to make the number here like 71 and then this number is going to be like 63 and then this is now like 74 degrees. That's really no different, okay? Because you know that the process is going to be the same. You want to make questions that are always applying it differently. You want to say, okay, so we've got a cliff here and there's a person at the top of the cliff and they're going to throw something down and then they know that it lands a certain distance away from them. If there was a person standing directly at the bottom of this cliff face, like what would the angle of this sort of be if this is, X and then this is Y or something like that. You want to make questions that are applying the information just lots of different ways. You want to think of like the hardest possible question you would get in an exam, and you want to try to make it yourself. So students that know how to use their knowledge will be able to create those questions. Because when you look at this, if there's an equation here, let's just call that equation number 1. And then there's another equation over here. Let's just call this equation number 2 over here. Then because they understand why this equation exists here and how it allows them to achieve all this other function here, it means that they can actually say, okay, so the relationship between equation number 1 and equation number 2 is through this pathway. So they're able to actually create questions that use these different types of pathways. They can say, okay, so there is a function that's looking at the acceleration of an airplane as it's traveling from one city to another city, and that function can be represented by the graph of whatever. The derivative of this rate is found to be this, and then the equation that we apply gives us the result of this. What would be the antiderivative of this using the antiderivative method, which is over here? So we can do that very easily because we know, oh, okay, so all we need to do is reverse this back to here, find the derivative, and then take that and then use that known derivative to use the antiderivative method or this particular equation. So because there is a web of understanding of how everything fits together, it should be straightforward to be able to create those really challenging questions where your friends will look at it and think, man, this is like a scholarship level, very difficult kind of question. This is the type of question that if it comes out in the news, comes out in an exam, it will end up on the news because students struggle with it. You want to challenge yourself to make those types of questions. And if you struggle to make those types of questions, there is a relatively high chance that your conceptual understanding of why the equations exist and how to use them is flawed, and it would actually be more time efficient for you to go back to that level and try to understand that rather than trying to just keep doing more practice questions, because the inability to make these types of questions shows that you're not able to operate at these higher levels where you can evaluate and analyze different equations and different types of problems against each other. You're not able to make that comparison. It means that you're stuck down here at the apply, memorize, or understand level where you understand a single equation and you can apply it, but you're not able to use them in conjunction. So your goal is to get up here as quickly as possible. So if you're struggling to make your own questions, but you can still answer questions, then that means that you need to go back to your mind map You need to look at those keywords and concepts again and really make sure that you've got a very clean understanding of how everything fits together and the general purpose behind everything. And then you can go back to the questions and you can try to make your questions again. So the combination of this and this is very protective for any type of question that you're going to get in a maths exam. And I have, trust me, looked at a lot of maths exams in preparation to make this video. And I can definitively say across 3-year levels and 6, 7 actually different curriculums, including IB, I didn't find a single question that I thought should not be relatively easily answerable by someone who practices in this way. But I saw plenty of questions that I thought lots of students would struggle with if they simply try to repeat again and again and just do millions of different practice questions without actually understanding why or how the equation works and how it fits into the grand scheme of that topic, or why even that topic is relevant and important. So the skin step here is consolidating relationships and finding patterns through the act of practicing questions as well as making your own questions. And maybe you even want to pair up with a friend and you can make questions to each other and share them with each other. Okay, and that would be a great thing for you to find a buddy with in your I Can Study group and do something like that. Okay, and make each other challenge questions and really test your ability to do that.
Bit of a dive into some of the more nuanced issues with chunking. This is really talking about stuff that isn't a problem per se, but it is an efficiency gain that can actually make the quality of your chunking better. It can make it faster and easier to do the processing required, and it's really what we're looking for at the higher levels of mastery. I would say that this is kind of the level of skill we're aiming for, to be able to use this confidently across a range of different subjects at a range of different difficulties without finding that your results or the feeling that you're getting or the effect of the technique is inconsistent. And so what we're talking about today is the idea of intuitive chunking. And intuitive chunking is a more advanced form of chunking, because not only are we saying that we at this point have a very clear chain between inquiry, discovering relationships, leading to chunk formation. Not only are we saying that we're able to use inquiry to create high quality chunks, not only are we saying those high quality chunks are importance based, and not only are we then looking at other ways of chunking to decide which way is most effective, but we're also leveraging off of our prior knowledge as much as possible. So when we talk about the idea of intuitive chunking, what it means is that the chunk structure and a chunk and its subchunks don't feel like they require a lot of memorization. So a chunk structure that requires lots of memorization would be if the chunks were simply terminology. You'd look at it and you'd think there's no possible way that I can remember that without purely just having memorized it. And I've talked about this previously as well, and you may have heard me talk about it in live clinics and things as well. However, now is really a focus where we want to make sure that we're consistent with this as much as possible. So there are certain ways of chunking and chunk patterns that are just generally more logical because we already know how to think about this, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to look at a key example of someone studying medicine, but you could use this for really anything. So even if you're not medically trained, you will still be able to follow along and understand the pattern of thinking here, and you'll see how you could apply this exact same thinking to really any subject. And indeed, whenever I study business or marketing or economics or accounting or even arts related things. I mean, education is technically arts. So this method of intuitive chunking is actually relevant and applicable even then. So let's have a look at what we're really talking about here. So one of the things that we can see that would point out the potential that we can maybe chunk this a little bit differently is if we evaluate the chunks that we are seeing here, we can see that there is, first of all, a single node chain. We see a single node chain here. So it goes failure, dialysis, and this dialysis point is a node that only chains on to this next chunk. So whenever you see a single node chain, you always think, is there another way of chunking this that could make it better? And it's not always the case that you can, but often it's at least worth considering. If we look at the chunks in themselves, we will also see that there is a lot of sort of terminology-based chunking here. So for example, if we go down to renal damage, and it's a little bit hard to sort of see this too much in detail or read it, but this says UT, this says glomerulus, which, this is a part of the kidney, which is what renal stands for. So this is a topic talking about kidney damage. And so what we can see here is that it's divided kidney damage into the loss of function. So that's relatively intuitive. If we were to think, okay, kidney damage and kidney damage means that there's loss of function, that feels relatively intuitive as it is. However, it's not as intuitive for us to then say, okay, we can divide kidney damage into loss of function followed by glomerulus. It's a very specific piece of terminology that we are using there, and it doesn't feel natural to divide it that way. If one of the chunks is function loss, which seems relatively intuitive, relatively logical, we would maybe expect the other chunk to be maybe change in anatomy or characteristics or types of damage or something like that, something that feels in the same level of intuitiveness. Whereas we're straight away going into terminology on the bottom half. So that's an area where it seems a little bit off. So that's another indication that we can do more intuitive chunking. And we can see the same thing that's happening in the higher levels here as well. So if we talk about function loss, it's divided into acute and chronic. Now, these are kind of specific terms, but in medicine, the words acute and chronic are used so commonly that it is essentially an intuitive way of thinking for most medical people to think about it in terms of acute and chronic. Acute means sort of faster onset, shorter time period. It's kind of happening here in the here and now. Chronic is sort of more long-standing stuff that tends to last like months or years, as a very simple explanation. So, dividing it into something that's acute versus chronic, that seems relatively intuitive. And then we're saying both of these things can lead to failure. Okay, and this person's done actually something that's good here, which is they've put ESRD underneath it, or ESRF, which is end-stage renal failure. And that's specific terminology. Now, an alternative way that this person could have maybe chunked this is to say, okay, both of these things lead to failure, which is end-stage renal disease. But that would have created a single node chain because we would have ended up with this leading to failure and then failure simply just leading to end-stage renal disease. So by collapsing that into a single chunk with a main chunk heading and then a subtitle, we're able to reduce the amount of single node chaining. So this is correct technique here. If there was a single node chain, we can do this. And this is relatively a good structure here, going from function loss, going to acute and chronic, but then coming together into the fact that it creates failure. Another way that we could have represented this is to go straight from function loss straight line to failure. And what that would be doing is it would be actually representing different types of focuses on the information. So with this current formation, the chunk structure is emphasizing and therefore is making more memorable. This is the way we're organizing it in our heads. It's emphasizing the fact that function loss is split into two different types, but both of them come together to create failure. That's what's emphasized by this chunk structure and this shape. And me knowing about this topic, I feel that that is actually a pretty appropriate and important way of representing the information. Another way, like I mentioned, we could have done is just simply taken function loss and drawn an arrow directly through to failure. And then we could have had acute and chronic coming off the sides of function loss. Okay, coming off the sides of function loss. So what that would have shown is more just the process of going from function loss to failure, and that there are two different types of function loss. It's almost showing the same thing, but it's not putting the emphasis on the idea that both types of function loss still lead to failure. And I think in the context of the topic, that is an important point. So I would agree with presenting it this way more. in this case, rather than having just this, an arrow going to failure and then splitting off function loss into two different types. But it's not to say that that's always the right way. Sometimes, depending on the topic, depending on the type of information, it makes more sense to branch it off and have a clearer backbone of just exactly how the process flows rather than doing it this way. And that's going to be about you making a decision about which chunking structure you feel is most appropriate for this particular topic. And that's a decision that you need to make. And there's not always a right or a wrong answer, but it's the active process of deciding which one you think makes the most sense. And again, this is that higher order learning, that real evaluative level where you are not just creating chunks, but you are evaluating which chunk structure makes the most sense. So this is good. But when we go from failure, we are seeing dialysis versus transplant. Again, these are fairly specific ways of going and branching off of it. If we say we've got end-stage renal disease, and we say, okay, well, what are the two main chunks of kidney failure? Dialysis versus transplant, both of which are treatment options. It doesn't feel intuitive. I don't feel like I would be able to hold on to that without having just memorized it, especially if it's new information. You know, it's a different thing if we've been dealing with kidney disease for weeks or months and we just intuitively know that obviously there's only two things from failure, dialysis, or transplant. That would be different because that's leveraging off our prior knowledge. But if we're learning this for the first time, then that's not intuitive already. It's not intuitive. We're not leveraging off of prior knowledge. So really here, we should have done a bit more importance-based chunking to say, well, why is dialysis important? Well, dialysis in the context of this kidney disease is important because it allows the human body to still perform the functions of the kidney, even though the kidney is failing. And dialysis is something that you put someone on with the hopes that eventually they will get a transplant and get a new kidney so that they don't need this treatment to allow the body to continue to filter out and excrete all the bad stuff. So that's why dialysis is important. Why is transplant important? Well, transplant is the thing that is hopefully going to fix the issue because you're actually giving them a new kidney. So you can see that here, we can say that, well, importance-based chunking would say that they are both things that happen in kidney failure, but they're both treatment options, and they're both treatment options for end-stage kidney failure. So we're seeing that there's ways that we can chunk this together. And so we want to think now, what's an intuitive way that we could divide this? So one thing that we could have done is we could have simply added an additional chunk here. So instead of going from failure directly to dialysis and transplant, we could have gone from failure and just added treatment options. Okay, because that seems relatively intuitive to say, okay, we've got failure and then how are we going to treat it? And then we could have divided that up into dialysis or transplant. So that would have added an additional chunk to our logic layer that allows us to anchor in that after failure, we're going to now look at treatment types. What they look like they've tried to do is actually use this medication box here to represent the idea that we are treating the failure. So again, that could possibly be an acceptable alternative, depending on how intuitive you feel it is that failure goes into these two options. So again, this is a medical example. However, it's not, you can apply this for your own subject. You're just thinking, does the way that I've structured these chunks seem to make sense? Does it seem intuitive? Okay. But there's more that we can do here, right? Because if we're looking at dialysis, we are now seeing that this single node chain leads directly to indications. Now, in medical speak, indications is basically, why do you do this? Like, in what situations would this treatment option be appropriate? So, for example, antibiotics, the indication for antibiotics is a bacterial infection, in which case you'd say that antibiotics are indicated when there is a bacterial infection. It means it's the appropriate treatment for this thing. So, in this case, dialysis leads to its indications. Now, this is forming a single node chain because there's nothing else on top of this. However, if we go into the indications, we can actually see that it's divided into peritoneal and then hemo. Now, these are actually two different types of dialysis. So we're actually going from dialysis through to when you should use it, through to the different types, right? So actually, we could have chunked this differently. We could have removed the single node chain by going indications versus types. Right? So that would be something that's a little bit more intuitive. Alternatively, we could have actually gone and restructured the entire top half here by saying, well, when is dialysis indicated and when is transplant indicated? And we could have separated it based on that. So level of severity or the stage that they're currently at or the timeline or progression of events. And that would have actually indicated more sort of when and why these different treatment options are available. And instead of putting these different indications and all this information out here in the leaves of the map, what we could have done is we could have maybe represented that straight away coming from failure, saying, in these situations, we are thinking of these types of treatment options, whereas in these situations, we're thinking of these types of treatment options. And I personally believe that for this mind map, that would have been a simpler and easier way of representing the information because it's more important space. Dialysis is important because, not that because it's a treatment option of failure. Dialysis is important in the context of here as a treatment option of failure when there is a relatively earlier stage and we are awaiting a transplant. Or if there is a sudden injury that maybe we can potentially recover from where we don't need to replace the kidney entirely. These are the situations where it seems more appropriate to have dialysis. So in that case, we would be using our reverse chunking to have dialysis as the end point. And the reasons for using it combined with the reasons for when transplant is more appropriate. And again, transplant would have been the end point. It would have been the detail that's at the leaves. So we would have been able to do some reverse chunking there. So again, these are more advanced nuances of chunking. However, always thinking, how can I make my chunks more intuitive? How can I represent this information so that I don't need to memorize too much? That's always going to be a way that allows you to iron in your important space chunking and really focus on, is the way that I've chunked it relying on memorization or relying on prior knowledge, things that already seem logical. And actually, if you go through the bottom half of the mind map, this is not a skinned version. This is purely straight away gone from shoot. So there's crossing arrows and lots of things that we can actually fix here. But again, here there are ways that it's being chunked where it is simply just a division of the information without really reflecting its importance. And so thinking, how can we make it more importance spaced would be appropriate. So for example, here they've said kidney damage. They've divided that into glomerulus. Again, this is an area of the kidney that is involved in doing lots of the filtering of your essentially what is going to become urine. And then they've divided into nephrotic versus nephritic. But actually, maybe a better way of chunking that would have been to say, instead of dividing into these two pieces of terminology that you then need to memorize characteristics of, we could have maybe done that in reverse, where we've said, okay, well, you can either have poor filtration, that means that there's protein versus blood, because that would potentially reflect the differences between these two more appropriately. And there's maybe a couple other ways that we could have split this up, where instead of having all the information to be memorized as the leaves of this chunk, that is actually fundamentally the way we chunk it in the first place. And what we memorize instead is that whole concept was called nephritic or nephrotic, right? So we're memorizing the terminology, not relying on the terminology to be the chunks themselves, because that creates more reliance on memorization. It relies less on our fundamental process of logic and the prior knowledge that we have that we can leverage off of, and it's going to increase the failure points for retrieval, and it can in some cases also be less time efficient as well. And even if you don't decide to actually change the way that you've chunked it, the thought that's gone into trying to figure out the best way to chunk it, the thought of trying to connect it with your prior knowledge to make it more intuitive, because remember, that's what intuitive means. It means there is prior knowledge that you're leveraging off of. That process in itself inherently is going to drive up your encoding and create higher order learning really at that top of the pyramid, the evaluation level. Okay, so these are all really important additional tips. If you're that semi around base camp level, we want to make sure that we're able to do this consistently. And again, let me reiterate that I've used a medical example here because it was just a handy one that I could use. But I can promise you, I have both done myself, had students that have done and have given feedback for and reviewed countless examples from almost every possible other domain of study there is. I've seen examples where people have been able to do this level of intuitive chunking very consistently to get good results. It does increase the cognitive load. However, remember by now, hopefully you realize that is a good thing. So we're going to be trying to aim for that. But regardless, as you practice these techniques and you modify your chunking and try to reach those higher levels of quality, especially by this stage of the course, you're going to need very high quality and very tuned in cobes that meets all of the criteria of high quality cobes, not just cobes, but that, very specific method of cobes that we do teach. You're going to need that because trying to figure out exactly how to do this correctly can sometimes be a subtle process. You may need to get feedback from people with more expertise, but it's a worthwhile investment of your effort and time to try to reach this level.